A warm welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. This week, ahead of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Rwanda, the embassy in Nigeria held a reception for member states just to give them a feel of what to expect in the meetings this week. The U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, paid a one-day visit to Nigeria, meeting with the Vice President, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, and the Chief of Staff, Professor Ibrahim Gambari, plus an excerpt of her exclusive interview with my colleague, Maope Ogun-Yusuf. Our discussion this week is on the candidacy status granted Ukraine by the European Union. My guest is Professor Christopher Isike. We'll learn more about him later. But first, a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles.
Ключова тактична мета окупантів не змінилась.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his country is only one step away from fully fledged integration into the EU. He made the comment as he delivered his regular evening address on Friday. In the video, President Zelensky said his country is waiting for the European Council's decision this week, when leaders of EU countries are expected to endorse the membership candidacy decision at a summit. Though only the start of a process that may take many years, it puts Ukraine on course to realize an aspiration that would have been beyond its reach just months ago. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says the conflict in Ukraine could last for years. He was speaking in an interview with a German newspaper, adding that the supply of state-of-the-art weaponry to Ukrainian troops would increase the chance of liberating the eastern Donbas region from Russian control.
And strong defense.
The European Union top human rights official says war crimes committed in Ukraine will be thoroughly investigated. He spoke after walking around ruined and wrecked cars in Irpin, a town near the Ukrainian capital Kiev, which became the scene of heavy fighting early in the invasion.
When we talk about war crimes, we talk not only about those who committed the crime, the direct crime, on the spot and in location. They, of course, have responsibility. But we're also talking about those who are in the chain of command, if necessary, right to the very top. But that has to be pursued by investigation of those who are carrying it out.
And finally, the acting U.S. Consul General James Soar and the Director General of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, Professor Abba Tijani, have launched the U.S. Public Diplomacy Engagement Space at the National Museum, Lagos. They were also joined by the Permanent Secretary to the Lagos State Ministry of Youth and Social Development, Dr. Aino Ayola. Mr. Soar said the project will help facilitate learning in an engaging environment for students and promote common ideals between the United States and Nigeria. He also said U.S. government-funded programs have been of immense benefit to Nigerians, boosting intellectual and cross-cultural capital, and have also become catalysts for professional alumni networks that help address global challenges. Dr. Ayola commended the U.S. government for its continued partnership with Nigeria, especially in providing children with holistic educational experience.
Welcome back. The 26th Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting takes place this week in Kigali, the Rwandan capital. It was originally scheduled for June 26th to 27th in 2020, but was postponed twice because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ahead of the meeting in Kigali, the Rwandan High Commission in Abuja, Nigeria's capital, held a reception for representatives of member states. High Commissioner Stanislas Kamanzi said Rwanda is ready to welcome member states and their delegations, and that CHOGM this year will provide a platform for debates and game-changing decisions on issues of common interest, such as governance and rule of law, sustainability between the economy and the government, health, technology, innovation, and of course, the youth.
CHOGM 22 will be held under the theme we all know now, which is delivering a common future, connecting, innovating, transforming. It will serve as a wide platform.
This year's theme is delivering a common future, connecting, innovating, transforming. And also speaking at the event was the UK's High Commissioner to Nigeria, Katrina Lang, who indicated the UK was enthused about handing over chairmanship of CHOGM to Rwanda. She also referred to the Russian invasion of Ukraine as reason why Commonwealth countries need to be more united at this time. Of course, the role Nigeria has played and the Commonwealth she also played up.
As Chair, the UK has worked with our Commonwealth partners. We've had three main objectives during our time. Firstly, to champion human rights. Secondly, to boost intra-Commonwealth trade. And thirdly, to support climate action, particularly in the most vulnerable member states. So we look forward to working with Rwanda as the incoming chair and the rest of the Commonwealth family to maintain momentum on these important issues. However, we must, of course, recall that much has changed since the UK hosted CHOGM in 2018. The world has been shaken by this unprecedented global pandemic and more recently by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And both of these events have impacted significantly on the global economy and, of course, the Commonwealth nations. And in this context, this is a time where Commonwealth countries as a family need to come together, stand up for our shared values as enshrined in the Commonwealth Charter. This has never been more important. We recall, of course, that the third Commonwealth Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Chief Emeka Anyaka, was a Nigerian. And Nigeria, of course, hosted CHOGM in Abuja in 2003, the last time Her Majesty was in Nigeria. And President Buhari himself is very committed to the Commonwealth. He recently wrote an op-ed about cooperation between Commonwealth countries. And the President said, and I quote, "What holds us back is only the limit of our ambition." So he has set us a high ambition for a united and more ambitious Commonwealth.
And then a toast to Her Majesty the Queen. And the U.S. Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, was in Nigeria last week on a one-day visit. During her time here, she and Vice President Professor Yemi Osinbajo had a chat about the need for more concerted efforts to effectively tackle the spread of terrorism, especially in the Sahel region, the significance of free, fair, and peaceful elections, improving security in the Sahel region, and the adoption of gas as a transition fuel in developing countries, among other issues of mutual interest. And later, she met with the Chief of Staff, Professor Ibrahim Gambari, before settling down with my colleague, Malpe Ogun Yusuf, and once again highlighting America's efforts at helping Nigeria fight terrorism and her thoughts on how the Russian war in Ukraine will end.
It's highly significant that you're here just a few days after we've celebrated Democracy Day here in Nigeria, and you're right smack in the middle of when we've just concluded primaries. The frontline candidates and the midst of picking their running mates, etc. I'm just a little curious. Is your visit a coincidence?
It's not a coincidence, Mo. It's great to be with you. We are here to join Nigerians in celebrating the start of a very exciting election season.
Now let's talk about security. It continues to be an ongoing concern. The United States has been pretty supportive in that regard. Nonetheless, the influence of international terror groups seem to be growing. A case in point is the recent attack in a church in Owo in Ondo State, where 40 people were killed. Yes. And the federal government believes that it has the imprints of ISWAP. What are your concerns in that regard as Nigeria continues to battle terrorism?
Well, we grieve with that community. I had a chance to talk to the bishop today, but it is unfortunately a widespread phenomenon that terrorists, try to use religion as one of the tools of domination, and we're concerned about the spread of ISWA, the spread of other forms of terrorism, not just in Nigeria, but throughout the Sahel.
I'm going to make this a double-barreled one, because I don't think that we can have you here and not mention Ukraine.
Yes.
Given the amount of work that you've done behind the scenes before now on the Ukraine question, and also the fact that, there's also the question of policy on Africa in general. I know that when the current Secretary of State visited in November, he spoke about, an evolving policy a resuscitation somewhat of policy between the United States, Africa as a whole, and maybe more specific countries. So first I'm going to ask you if there is now a little more clarity on what that policy will be. So I do not know if the United States is thinking about how the war between Russia and Ukraine is going to come to an end.
First of all, just with regard to U.S. policy towards Africa, we hope that Africans can see us more engaged, out traveling more, having meetings and engagements like this where we talk about the full range of challenges that we share, asking Africans to work with us on global challenges, whether it's health, whether it's climate, all of these things, and trying to listen more and be better partners, bringing more security support. I was in Somalia earlier on this trip. We have U.S. forces back in Somalia, as we talked about earlier, trying to bring more support here. So I think you'll see an evolving policy where we are talking about democracy, we're talking about prosperity, we're talking about green and clean governance, and we're also talking about security, because those are all the essential things that we have to do together, and about African leadership on global problems, which takes me to Ukraine and to Nigeria, which played and continues to play a very strong and important role in Africa and globally in calling out President Putin and his aggression against Ukraine, and the fact that he is egregiously violating UN Charter, sovereignty, territorial integrity of another country. This is not a Russia-Ukraine war, this is a Russian war against Ukraine. That's why the United States and our allies and partners across the world have been supporting Ukraine in its effort to defend itself, another $1 billion of weapons that we've just provided. Because imagine if this were Nigeria and a big neighbor with an army 4 times your size came and decided they wanted to bite off 2 more pieces of your country. Of course, we'd come to your support. So it's about principles that undergird everything that democracies believe in: sovereignty, territorial integrity, right of self-determination. Big guy doesn't get to decide the rules just because he's a big guy. But also, Russia's war is having a profound effect, not only on Africa, but on all countries, in terms of driving up what were already high fuel prices, high food prices, etc. So we are also, as a global community, trying to address those things. We talked about it today. One of the main themes of this trip that we've been on, which was Djibouti, Somalia, Mozambique, and now Nigeria, has been how do we join together in food security, in getting fuel prices down, and Nigeria will play a big role in that. You're obviously a hydrocarbon producer, which we need democratic sources of hydrocarbons so that countries can make that transition and get off Russian fuel, but you're also a fertilizer supplier, so you can help feed the world at this difficult time. But make no mistake what this is about. This is about Putin's aggression against Ukraine, a massive country against its smaller neighbor, for no other reason than his own imperial ambition, affecting all of us. So this war will end, obviously, at the diplomatic table, but only if we can pressure Putin into coming to that table. President Zelensky has been ready for direct talks with Putin for more than 100 days, and it is Putin who is refusing. So we ask Nigeria and all civilized countries to put maximum pressure on Russia to come to the table and end this war.
The war in Ukraine is still going strong. On Sunday, Russia's defense ministry said over the past 10 days, its forces have destroyed 10 howitzers and up to 20 military vehicles supplied by Western countries in Mykolaiv, where President Volodymyr Zelensky visited on Saturday. The UK's Ministry of Defense says both sides of the war, that is Russia and Ukraine, have continued to conduct heavy artillery bombardments on axis to the northeast and south of the Severodonetsk pocket, but with little change in the front line. They believe combat units on both fighting sides in the Donbass are likely to be experiencing variable morale, and the Ukrainian forces are likely to have seen desertions in recent weeks. Russian morale, they say, is likely to be low because of perceived poor leadership, limited opportunity for rotation of units out of combat, very heavy casualties, combat stress, continued poor logistics, and problems with pay, plus the fact that Russian soldiers are likely to remain confused about the war objective. The last week ended, however, with a glimmer of hope for Ukraine, when the European Commission announced it had recommended that Ukraine and Moldova should be granted candidate status for accession to the European Union. According to Ms. von der Leyen, who's the European Commission president, considering that Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia have shared the strong and legitimate aspiration for joining the EU, the European Commission has made positive evaluation on their applications and recommended that Ukraine and Moldova be granted candidate status. And that's where my interview with Professor Christopher Isike of the University of Pretoria is focused. That, of course, coming up after the break. Stay with us. Joining me now is Director, African Center for the Study of the United States, University of Pretoria in South Africa, Professor Christopher Isike. He joins me from Pretoria. Professor, thank you for joining me on the program.
Good evening, Marachi, and thank you for having me on your program.
I'm just learning that the EU Special Human Rights Representative, Eamon Gilmore, is in Ukraine this weekend, visiting Irpin to be exact. What do you think he'll find?
Well, he's already in Irpin, like you said, in Ukraine, and in my view, he did see what he was looking for. Essentially, he went to solidarize with Ukrainians and to get a close-up self-assessment of the situation there in Irpin, and I think he also went to Bucha. And I know that he tweeted yesterday where he said that he saw mass graves of casualties of Russia's war in Ukraine and other, evidence of war crimes committed by Russia, both in Bucha and Irpin. He also mentioned that he talked to refugees on the Poland border, and that he spoke to civil society groups such as, religious leaders who testified to some of the human rights abuses that he saw. So far, we must take into context, as at the end of May, over 4,000 people have been killed, including over 200 of them children. The United Nations Rights Office reported also that almost 5 million Ukrainians have, Ukrainian refugees have been recorded in Europe since the war started as of June 9th. So Gilmore's visit really helps to confirm some of these statistics firsthand.
Yeah. And do you think that that could help speed up the process for Ukraine's membership of the European Union?
Well, yes, it could, but it won't, unless the EU gives Ukraine a special waiver of its conditionalities. Otherwise, it will have to wait months, if not years, before this happens, just as we have seen in the case of Georgia. However, though, we have seen France President Emmanuel Macron, Germany's Olaf Scholz, as well as Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi and Romania's Prime Minister visit Kiev this past weekend, where they give a very qualified support for Kiev's bid to join the EU. So perhaps that special dispensation that I'm talking about is in the cards.
Yeah, and the European Union Commission on Friday granted Ukraine and Moldova candidacy status. What would that mean in real terms?
Well, it doesn't mean that it will end in a quick EU membership. Like I said just now, I talked about, unless you have a special dispensation that would, make Ukraine especially skip some of the rigorous conditions to join the EU bloc, which can take years, especially for a country that's at war. Some of these conditionalities range from creating a competitive market economy to guaranteeing democratic rule as well as the territorial integrity. Right now, these are not conditions that Ukraine meets easily. But like I said before, if there is a special dispensation, then of course, it can be fast-tracked.
And I'm just wondering, how this candidacy status will impact on the war in Ukraine. The Russian government says it's watching very closely, this relationship that's going on and this merger that's about to happen?
Well, I don't think it's going to change much, especially on the Russian side, as they've prosecuted this war on Ukraine from day one on the standpoint that Europe was with, Ukraine anyway. So this could only add to the evidence that Russia can draw from, to underscore its initial standpoint. On the Ukrainian side, this would motivate them to keep up their resistance, which, by the way, is very commendable, even in the face of Putin's smokescreen talk over the weekend about a coming new world order where every state should have the right to think and act for themselves.
And speaking of the Russian president, whom you mentioned earlier, at an economic forum, which is, where he talks about the new world era that's coming up, he slammed the West, for the sanctions that they have imposed, said Russia has survived through them, despite the isolation by the West. How the EU, he says, has lost political sovereignty, also slamming those economic policies. He said relations with the West will never be the same. We understand that. But do you think that there might be comparisons, with, how relations what shape relations will take on from now on? Can we compare that with, the end of the Second World War, or perhaps there are lessons to be learned from that?
Yes, there are comparisons for me because, essentially the issue is really more about the international system, than anything else. A lot of commentators have noticed, have always focused on the causal factors in terms of, between Russia and the United States. But many of these analyses have tended to neglect the role that the Ukrainian people have played in this, in terms of posturing Zelensky to go ahead with this war, and even the agency of Zelensky himself to either choose to go to this war or not. But that's besides the point. For me, the Russian war in Ukraine today is a product of the racist international system that is built on a racist ontology of beings versus non-beings, with Western Europeans as beings deserving of human rights and privileges heralded by the European Enlightenment age. I've made this argument before. On the other hand, non-Westerners, and this would include Africans, to include Arabs, the Caribbeans, Latin Americans, and even at some point, the Slavs, who make up most of Eastern Europe, were regarded as non-beings, zoned into nations and peoples whose sovereignties, were denigrated, whose humanity and existence were questioned, practically, and by denying them the full enjoyment of these rights and privileges that were accorded to the so-called beings. So this is how you want to understand, the international system that permits some countries that became rich and powerful on the back of exploiting other countries to then reward themselves and a few of their less powerful friends with permanent seats in the United Nations Security Council. It is hard to understand some of the countries, such as you have the US and Russia, breaking international law without fear of consequence. As we see Russia have done in the case of Ukraine, the US did in the case of Iraq, Syria, and Libya in the last 20 years alone. So this is how, for me, I understand this conflict. And for me, despite all the the casualties of war and all the negative press around it, the silver lining is that this war does present an opportunity to reform the international system. Whether we go to a third world war or not, there's an opportunity to reform the international system along the lines that Putin talks about, where every country would have, a right to determine for itself what it wants and who to engage with.
Yeah, and African countries have pretty much been left out of the conversation, haven't they? Except for, a few times when, African leaders have spoken about it, and then the Senegalese president representing the African Union was in Russia about 2 weeks ago to speak with President Vladimir Putin. And there's only talk about Africa when it comes to the food crisis. So when President Vladimir Putin talks about Russia entering a new era, do you think that he might also be considering Africa in this?
No, he's not. It's clearly not. Look, for all of them, whether it's the US, Russia, or China, Africa is an appendage, of the international system that I just described to you. In the non-beings category that I described of humans that they placed us at, we occupy the lowest rung of the racial ladder. So we have, as Africans, to smell the coffee and start thinking, for ourselves.
But Africa has been pushing for reforms in the United Nations Security Council for a permanent seat there. Professor Sike, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
That's the program this week. I am Amarachi Ubani. Thank you for watching.